In 1993, the sun had barely risen over the quiet town of Halstead, Missouri, when the first phone call came in. 4 teenage girls, Rachel Monroe, Lily Carr, Danielle Brooks, and Tasha Greene, had not returned home from their Friday evening school event. Their parents, frantic and disoriented, flooded the small police station by mid-morning, demanding answers. The officer on duty, a young patrolman named Lucas Webb, noted the time and details in a half-filled logbook, then directed the families to Detective Raymond Carter. Carter, in his mid-40s, had been with the Halstead PD for nearly 20 years, known equally for his efficiency and impatience. When the mothers arrived sobbing and the fathers clenching fists tight with fear, Carter didn't rise from his desk. He took the report with a sigh, scratched the back of his thinning hair, and muttered, "They'll be back by Sunday night. Girls like that always are." His tone was condescending, almost bored, as if 4 disappearances were as routine as a lost cat. One mother, Gloria Monroe, demanded action. Carter looked her square in the face and said, "Rachel has a record of running off. Maybe she's playing leader again." When they pleaded that this wasn't normal behavior, Carter shrugged. Teenagers rebel. You're all making this into something it's not. By the end of the day, the report was filed under possible runaways. No Amber Alert, no roadblocks, no helicopters. Just a dismissive sentence scrawled on a piece of paper and a warning to stop calling unless you have new information. The rumor mill in Halstead kicked in faster than any patrol car could have. The whispers started with bad parenting and snowballed into accusations. The Monroe girl had always been loud. Lily had been seen once near the liquor store. Danielle's boyfriend had a reputation. And Tasha? Well, her mother worked nights and let her do what she wanted. Soon, people were saying the girls had run off to join some cult out west. Or worse, they were on drugs and probably didn't want to be found. The more vile the story, the quicker it spread. Local news caught wind of it and spun their own tale. 4 girls vanish after dance, troubled teens, or something more. The families watched in horror as their daughters' names became punchlines, their photos plastered across screens beneath the words reckless, unstable, and delinquent. No one spoke of the bright futures they'd once held. No one recalled that Tasha wanted to be a veterinarian or that Danielle had won her school's poetry award the month before. The town didn't mourn them. It mocked them. In church, pews shifted. In grocery stores, shoulders turned. The families became outcasts in their own community. Their grief, now twisted by suspicion, was viewed as dramatic, exaggerated, even attention-seeking. The Monroes received an anonymous note on their porch that read, "Maybe if you raised her better, she'd still be here." That winter, Gloria Monroe stopped attending PTA meetings. The Brooks family moved to another county entirely. Only Reverend Jameson ever spoke on their behalf from the pulpit, but even he noticed how the congregation began avoiding eye contact. The cruelty wasn't just institutional. It was personal, cultural, systemic. The very soil of Halstead had turned against those who dared demand answers. Detective Carter remained unshaken. He gave 2 brief press statements within the first month, both filled with vagueness and innuendo. "We have no indication of foul play," he said. "These girls made a choice. Their parents need to accept that." When a reporter asked whether the department had interviewed possible witnesses, Carter replied, "We're not chasing ghosts or teenage tantrums. We have real cases to handle." The community nodded along. The mayor, up for re-election, praised the police department for prioritizing valuable resources. And just like that, the case was shelved. The walls of the station held no flyers. The girls' names weren't on the active board. Carter went on with his other cases, filing DUIs, attending city meetings, and playing poker every Friday with the sheriff and 2 city council members. When asked in private about the case, Carter was known to say, "Dead girls don't come back. And those ones? They brought it on themselves." His disdain wasn't hidden. It was worn like a badge. One morning, 6 weeks after the disappearance, Gloria Monroe stood outside the station holding a cardboard sign that read, "Where are our DHers?" She stood silently from dawn till dusk. Cars drove by. Some honked, others spat at her feet. A group of teenagers walked past and shouted, "Ask Rachel's drug dealer." No one in uniform came out to support her, not even Carter. When the local paper published a photo of her the next day, the caption read, mother or menace. It was more than neglect. It was erasure. Over time, other cases came and went, a gas station robbery, a fire in a trailer park, but the girls were never found. The trail, if it ever existed, went cold. No new evidence, no new suspects. And so the silence took root. A community that once praised itself for its unity now turned its back on its most desperate. Halstead didn't just forget the girls. It chose to bury them beneath shame and speculation. For the families, the pain remained constant, raw, a wound that the town kept salting. For Detective Carter, it was just another file pushed to the back of a cabinet. For the town, it was easier to believe the girls were wild than to admit something far darker might have taken them. Summary. In 1993, 4 girls disappeared from Halstead, Missouri. Detective Raymond Carter and the town dismissed the case as a runaway stunt, blaming the victims' families and spreading damaging rumors. No serious investigation followed, and the town chose denial and cruelty over accountability. The file sat untouched in the Halstead Police Department's archive room, collecting dust like a scar left open to fester. While the grieving families still lit candles on porches and left porch lights on through endless nights, inside the station, the disappearance of the 4 girls was treated as a resolved inconvenience. Raymond Carter, at the time still confident in his position, walked the halls with a clip of swagger, protected not by competence, but by loyalty. Specifically, loyalty to Police Chief Wesley Harlan, a man more concerned with politics than policing. Harlan, nearing retirement and with mayoral aspirations of his own, had made it clear in a private meeting with Carter just 2 weeks after the disappearances that Halstead needed to move on. "There's an election coming," Harlan had said, his voice low, eyes flicking to the surveillance camera in the corner of the chief's office, before continuing in a whisper, "And I'm not letting 4 drama queens ruin this town's reputation." He slid a folder across the desk. Inside was a memo signed off to close the case as a presumed runaway group, no further action needed unless physical evidence surfaced. Carter hadn't hesitated. He initialed the paper and filed it away under administrative compliance. At that moment, the door to justice for the Monroe, Carr, Brooks, and Greene families was quietly slammed shut. The next week, something far worse happened. A convenience store clerk named Hector Pena came forward with a security tape that showed the girls entering the store the night they disappeared. It was time-stamped 10:37 p.m., just 15 minutes after their supposed arrival home. What made the footage strange was not only the late hour, but the fact that they were waiting. At one point, Lily glanced toward the parking lot and whispered something to Danielle, who then pulled her hood tighter and turned away from the camera. Hector turned the footage into the department, where it was logged by a part-time assistant and placed in evidence. Carter reviewed it once in the back room with Deputy Max Cullen. Then the tape vanished. Days later, when Hector returned asking if he could have a copy for personal protection, he was told the evidence never existed. The entry in the evidence log had been whited out. Carter never spoke of the tape again. But Cullen did. Years later, after being reassigned to traffic patrol, he told a bar patron he once saw a tape that would have reopened the case in seconds. The patron thought he was joking. Everyone in Halstead had a story like that, just enough to raise suspicion, but never enough to change anything. What the public didn't know was that a local high school teacher, Mrs. Anita Harrow, had submitted a formal report just 1 week before the girls vanished. It detailed an encounter she witnessed between Lily Carr and a male janitor, William Gertz, who had a prior record in another county for inappropriate conduct, a fact that had been conveniently buried when he was hired. Mrs. Harrow had caught Gertz cornering Lily behind the theater curtain after school hours, his hand too close to her waist. When confronted, he claimed he was just showing her where the fuse box was. Harrow didn't buy it. She filed a written report to the school principal, who handed it off to the police department as per district protocol. But by the time it reached Carter's desk, the paper had mysteriously gone missing. When Harrow followed up weeks later, she was told no such report existed. She was advised to watch what she accused people of if she wanted to keep her job. Within the semester, she had resigned and moved to another district, and the school quietly phased Gertz out during summer maintenance. All of this occurred while the parents continued holding meetings in church basements and town libraries, trying desperately to reopen an investigation that the authorities had not only failed to pursue, but had actually undermined. Carter, meanwhile, continued his steady climb, receiving a commendation from the city for outstanding departmental management in 1994 and promoted to lieutenant by the end of that year. Harlan's plan worked. The mayoral election came and went without a hitch. The disappearance of 4 teenage girls, once a headline, was now a footnote, swallowed whole by a town eager to forget. Behind closed doors, Carter would later admit to himself that he wasn't sure if they'd run, been taken, or something worse, but he didn't care. In his mind, the town's peace was worth the truth being buried. And then, 10 years later, in 2003, during a routine audit of archived cases, a city administrator flagged the Halstead PD for irregularities in evidence storage. Among the items missing were several tapes, including one labeled Monroe Group Convenience Footage. The administrator made note of it, but did not report it further. Harlan was already a state senator by then. Carter had been promoted again. No one wanted to stir old waters. But a few weeks after that audit, Carter received an unmarked envelope at his home. Inside was a photo of the missing girls, taken in that convenience store, clear as day. On the back was a handwritten note. "You know this didn't go away." Carter burned the photo in his fireplace that night, then drank himself unconscious. By then, even he had begun to fear what still lingered under the surface of Halstead. Summary. As the investigation was deliberately derailed, Police Chief Harlan and Detective Carter chose political safety over truth. Evidence was destroyed, reports erased, and credible witness accounts ignored to protect reputations and elections. The town's institutions failed the victims completely. By the time the second year passed without a single trace of the girls, Halstead's police department had not only buried the case, but twisted it into a parable of small-town caution. It became the silent warning spoken at dinner tables and whispered behind church pews. Keep your daughters quiet. Don't let them be like Rachel Monroe. Carter especially harbored a personal vendetta against her, one rooted in a classroom incident from 2 years prior, when Rachel, then 15, had filed a formal complaint accusing Carter's nephew, a school resource officer, of intimidation. The complaint had gone nowhere, buried by internal HR procedures, but Carter never forgot it. He saw Rachel as a manipulator, a girl who craved attention and chaos, and when she disappeared along with the others, he convinced himself she had orchestrated it all. In private, he told colleagues she probably got the others involved in some elaborate runaway stunt or crime spree. Her past disciplinary record became his blueprint for dismissing every angle that might have led to a real breakthrough. The fact that Rachel had once skipped school for 3 days to protest the district's dress code policies only fed into Carter's narrative. He viewed her as a problem child who was always chasing a spotlight, and in his mind she was capable of dragging others into that darkness for the sake of spectacle. His bias wasn't just professional, it was deeply emotional. Whenever the Monroe family called the station asking for updates, Carter barely concealed his contempt. He told one of the dispatchers to let the call ring out. "They want sympathy for raising a brat," he said. "Let them find it somewhere else." His obsession with Rachel grew to the point where he kept a separate folder on her, one not officially sanctioned or recorded in department logs. In it were notes he had gathered over the years, teachers' complaints about her argumentative behavior, an anonymous letter from a classmate who accused her of starting drama to feel important, and a grainy photograph taken outside a gas station where she stood talking to a much older man. Carter believed, without any proof, that Rachel had faked the entire disappearances to escape consequences, or to create a name for herself, and that the other girls were either manipulated into following her or were complicit in the scheme. This theory not only blinded him to alternative leads, but gave him an excuse to ignore every piece of evidence that contradicted it. What Carter never acknowledged, however, was that Rachel wasn't the only one who had raised alarms before vanishing. Danielle Brooks had visited her school counselor 2 months prior, speaking vaguely of being watched and after a cheerleading practice. The counselor filed a confidential report and flagged the district's wellness coordinator, who in turn relayed the concern to the police department. But the officer assigned to follow up, Deputy Cullen, the same man who had seen the missing convenience store footage, never did. He claimed his workload was too high, that too many kids made too many vague threats, and that if something was serious, it would have sounded serious. The report was marked "No action needed" and archived. That same month, a high school English teacher named Miss Lucille Hartford submitted her own report after overhearing a disturbing exchange between two girls in the hallway. One of them had said she didn't want to go to the Red Room anymore and mentioned the smell of bleach. Miss Hartford, alarmed, wrote down the details and submitted it directly to Principal Dale Forrester, who promised to pass it along. 2 weeks later, she followed up. The principal told her no such report existed. Days later, her classroom was reassigned, and her end-of-year contract was quietly terminated. Halstead's school system wasn't just negligent, it was complicit in silencing those who asked questions. Teachers who raised concerns were shuffled out, warned against stirring fear or spreading rumors. Staff members who attempted to look into disciplinary gaps or strange behavioral patterns were told to focus on the curriculum. Within months, any paper trail that might have connected faculty concerns to the missing girls vanished. In hindsight, Carter would later admit during an off-the-record conversation that he remembered Miss Hartford. He said she had overreacted to gossip and had a savior complex. He never asked her what else she had heard or why she insisted her students were in danger. He simply let her be discarded, like every other piece of the puzzle that didn't fit his belief that Rachel was the architect of it all. That belief began to falter years later when, during a high school renovation project in 2010, construction workers discovered an old locker behind a drywall partition in the staff room hallway. Inside were notes passed between students, some dating back to the early 90s. One in particular stood out. It was folded into the shape of a butterfly, and inside was Rachel Monroe's distinct handwriting. Cut it and read, "If anything happens to me, tell Miss Hartford to check the red curtain." The note made its way to the school district's archives and was eventually passed along to Carter, who was by then only months from retirement. He laughed when he saw it, called it a high school prank, and threw it in the shredder. But the janitor, who found it, remembered the words. He had once cleaned the old drama room, the one with red velvet curtains and a broken ventilation system that always smelled faintly of pool chemicals. Years later, that janitor's son, a volunteer with a local historical preservation group, would bring the story back to life. Back in the late 90s, as the Monroe, Carr, Brooks, and Greene families continued pressing for an independent investigation, they met fierce resistance from local government, from school administrators, and from the police department. The town's mayor at the time, Luther Winford, insisted the girls had run away, and that reopening the case would only feed paranoia and hysteria. What no one in Halstead realized then was that Rachel Monroe was not just a rebellious teen, she was also Mayor Winford's niece. Her mother and the mayor had been estranged for years, and Rachel had never publicly acknowledged the relationship, but privately she had once told Danielle that her uncle scared her, that he had too many secrets, that she'd found something in his office one summer while staying with him that didn't make sense. Danielle, always the worrier, had told her not to mess with it. That same summer was the last time the mayor ever invited Rachel to stay over. Carter's obsession with Rachel and his refusal to pursue alternate theories wasn't only about his bruised ego or past grievances. It was also about the quiet pressure from above, the same pressure that had led to the destroyed evidence, the buried reports, and the slow rout of public trust. Every person who tried to speak the truth was dismissed as unstable, paranoid, or delusional. Every thread that could have unraveled the case was clipped before it could weave a picture, and in that vacuum of accountability, the town constructed a version of events that painted the girls as reckless and their families as unhinged. But deep beneath that narrative, in sealed files and hidden lockers, the truth was still waiting to be found. By 1997, the Halstead Police Department had stopped pretending to care. The case of the missing girls was no longer a source of pressure or public scrutiny. It had become an inside joke. Raymond Carter, now a commanding figure in the department with years of blind promotions behind him, carried himself like a man who had won a quiet war. He gave press briefings not to inform, but to perform. During one such briefing, when asked whether any progress had been made on the case of Rachel Monroe and her friends, Carter smirked and said, "We can't investigate every teenage drama in town. If I chased down every runaway who wanted attention, I'd need a whole new department." The cameras caught the slight chuckle under his breath, and the mayor, still Luther, Winford, stood by his side, without flinching. To the families watching at home, it wasn't just dismissive, it was humiliating. Their daughters were being treated as punchlines, and the officers sworn to protect them had become showmen playing to an audience of denial. Inside the department, the culture reflected Carter's attitude. The younger officers learned quickly that bringing up the 1993 case was a mistake. Those who asked questions were told to focus on current crimes. Those who had only been in hostage a year made the mistake of referencing a missing person tip in a morning briefing. Carter interrupted him, laughed, and said, "Those girls are either tanning in Mexico or buried by now. Either way, we've moved on. So should you." The room laughed. The officer didn't bring it up again. In bars around town, off-duty deputies like Max Cullen bragged openly about how the case had been tied off clean. At O'Shaughnessy's Tavern, Cullen once told a bartender and two locals, "We knew they weren't coming back, but let the families chase their fairy tales, it kept them out of our way." He raised his glass and toasted the real men who knew how to shut a door. No one reported him. People laughed. The tragedy had become folklore, twisted beyond recognition, distorted into something less inconvenient than the truth. The contempt stretched far beyond the precinct walls. In schools, students were warned not to associate with the siblings of the missing girls. Teachers were discouraged from assigning projects about the case. One high school history teacher who assigned a paper on local unsolved crimes was quietly pulled into a meeting with the principal and told that some histories are better left untouched. At the local church, a memorial plaque for the girls was removed under the pretext of remarkable. It was never replaced. Parents who had once supported the families now crossed the street to avoid them. Gloria Monroe, Rachel's mother, tried to organize a candlelight vigil in 1998. Only 2 neighbors showed up. One of them apologized afterward, saying her husband didn't want her to get involved again. The silence was no longer passive. It was enforced. Carter reveled in his own invincibility. His name carried weight at the town council. He played poker with the mayor. He had his own reserved parking space behind the station and took 3 weeks off every summer without anyone daring to question it. In meetings, he referred to the 1993 case as the ghost. He kept a folder in his drawer labeled Wild Geese. Inside were clippings from the early days, photos of the girls, and a few typed statements from officers who had long since resigned or moved away. He read from it like a script when new officers asked about it, then closed it and said, "That's all you need to know. The rest is noise." Behind his back, some called him a relic. Others called him untouchable. To his face, everyone called him Sir. Even Sheriff Elias Granger, who operated the county department, began to sense that something was wrong. He had never been directly involved in the case, but the more he interacted with the Halstead PD, the more uneasy he became. During a shared jurisdiction training session, he asked Carter if the case would ever be revisited. Carter chuckled and said, "Revisited? I barely visited it the first time. Those girls were trouble, Sheriff. We did the town a favor by closing the book." Granger didn't laugh. Later that week, he began pulling archived files from the county's limited records. What he found disturbed him: missing timestamps, vague interview summaries, unsigned reports. A file labeled Classroom Incident, RM, had no details, just a date, and Carter's initials complaint from 1993 was blank beyond the header. Granger made a copy of what he could, but most of it led nowhere. The trail had been scrubbed. At a town luncheon later that year, Carter received a plaque for service to community. The mayor handed it to him with a smile and said, "There are leaders who work in daylight and those who protect us in the dark. Raymond Carter is both." Applause followed Carter, had not solemnly, but inside he didn't feel solemn. He felt victorious. He had survived every whisper, dodged every question, buried every inconvenient thread. He believed the town was his, that the truth had been successfully rewritten. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the truth had not been erased. It had only been waiting, And in that waiting, seeds of doubt were beginning to grow. By the early 2000s, Halstead had changed its surface, but not its soul. The fresh coats of paint on downtown buildings, the newly landscaped Memorial Park, and the refurbished police headquarters served as glossy distractions from the unresolved pain that haunted the town's edges. To the casual outsider, it looked like a peaceful Midwestern town with friendly shops and manicured sidewalks. But for the families of Rachel Monroe, Lily Carr, Danielle Brooks, and Tasha Greene, the quiet had never stopped screaming. After years of being publicly dismissed and privately humiliated, the parents no longer appeared at city council meetings or school board sessions. They stopped writing letters to the editor. They stopped setting up vigils that no one attended. The silence from the town had beaten their voices into dust. Gloria Monroe, once a fiery PTA chair who had marched into the police station demanding answers, no longer spoke above a whisper. Her hair had turned gray before her time, and she rarely left her home except to visit the overgrown patch of grass where she used to place birthday candles for her daughter. The families lived in the same neighborhoods as before, but they had become ghosts, drifting through streets where once they had been known by name. Now regarded as an unpleasant memory everyone wanted to forget. Danielle's father, Everett Brooks, suffered most visibly. A construction foreman who had once led a work crew with booming laughter and endless coffee-fueled energy, he had turned into a withdrawn shadow of himself. He stopped showing up to job sites, he stopped shaving, he spoke in broken sentences, if at all. His wife left in 2002, unable to survive another year of watching him dissolve from the inside out. One night in 2004, a phone call came into the Halstead tip line, a voice claiming to have seen a girl who looked like Danielle working at a gas station in Arizona. Everett heard about it from a former friend and drove 14 hours to Tucson, stopping only to refuel and reheat the same burger 3 times. He arrived at the address, found the girl behind the counter, and asked her name. It wasn't Danielle. She wasn't even from Missouri. When he returned to his hotel, he found a note under his windshield wiper that read, "You're wasting your life. Let her go." He returned home and hanged himself in the garage, leaving a note that read, "I can't keep chasing ghosts when no one else believes they were ever real." The local paper ran a 1-paragraph obituary. No one from the city government or police department attended the funeral. The Greene family sold their house and left town entirely. Tasha's mother, Brenda, had been the most defiant of the group in the early years, shouting at press conferences and handing out flyers at every county fair within a 100-mile radius. But after being spit on at a 4th of July parade and hearing rumors that her daughter had probably OD'd and ended up in a ditch, she stopped. One day she packed up the bedroom that hadn't changed since 1993, folded the red cheerleading uniform that still hung behind the closet door, and placed it in a cedar box. They moved to Oregon without telling anyone. Their house remained empty for 2 years before a young couple bought it and gutted the room where Tasha's trophies had once lined the shelves. They painted the walls a pale yellow and never asked about the name carved into the baseboard near the window. Across town, Lily Carr's younger brother, Marcus, had grown up in a household where silence was law. Their father never spoke about Lily, not during dinner, not at church, not when Marcus graduated. Lily's name was banned like a curse, and over time, Marcus began to believe he had imagined her altogether. He moved to Chicago and changed his last name. He didn't come back to Halstead, even for his father's funeral. The emotional isolation wasn't limited to the families. Those who had once tried to help, to ask questions, or to speak publicly in support of reopening the case, found themselves slowly pushed out. Miss Lucille Hartford, the English teacher who had filed multiple concerns about Rachel and her classmates in the months before the disappearances, lost her job in 1994 under the pretense of budget cuts. She took a job in another district, but was never able to teach again without the cloud of suspicion trailing behind her. Her replacement, a younger teacher fresh out of college, was instructed by the principal to avoid indulging the drama crowd. When she asked what that meant, she was told, "Ones who act like they're solving mysteries. Just keep them busy and out of the headlines." One student in 2005 tried to launch a podcast on unsolved cases in small towns, choosing the Halstead 4 as her first topic. The school principal suspended her for misusing school equipment and defaming community officials. Her parents received a warning call from someone on the school board advising them to teach their daughter the value of respect. The podcast never aired. In the church pews, the names of the girls were removed from prayer lists. A new pastor arrived in 2007 and instructed the congregation to focus on healing, not the past. When Gloria Monroe approached him after service and asked to light a candle for Rachel, he told her gently but firmly that this church is for the living. She never returned. The names Rachel, Lily, Danielle, and Tasha became taboo in Halstead. Speaking them aloud was a form of rebellion. Remembering them was a quiet act of defiance. A local bookstore that once carried a scrapbook collection of community history removed the section about the girls after repeated complaints. The owner, when asked, said, "We need to move forward." A new generation of residents had moved into Halstead, many unaware of the story. The official narrative had been scrubbed clean. Online searches returned only sparse headlines. School yearbooks no longer included memorial pages. Their faces disappeared from hallways, from news clippings, from town memory. And yet, in the corners of attics and the backs of closets, their belongings remained: a necklace and a jewelry box, a hairbrush with initials carved into the handle, a torn page from a diary that had somehow evaded the purge. These small fragments of their lives were kept by parents too scared to display them and too broken to throw them away. Carter still walked the halls of the police station, now older and slower, but still respected. Every year, when the anniversary of the disappearance came around, he made sure no press releases were issued, no memorials organized. When asked in a rare interview whether the case would ever be reopened, he said, "There's nothing left to reopen. Time took care of it, but time hadn't taken care of it. Time had only buried it, and beneath the soil of silence, something had begun to stir." On a gray afternoon in the spring of 2020, Raymond Carter, now long retired, long forgotten by the state press, and battling the quiet decline of age, stood in the Halstead Police Department's evidence archive for the first time in over a decade. The fluorescent lights flickered weakly overhead, casting pale shadows over metal shelving units lined with cardboard boxes, faded labels, and thin plastic evidence bags. He was there not for official business, but at the request of a former colleague who now worked part-time for the city's Historical Preservation Committee, which had taken on the task of reorganizing unprocessed evidence from the 1,980 S90s before the facility downsized. Carter hadn't intended to stay more than 10 minutes. He wasn't a sentimental man. He didn't want to relive the years of mounting scrutiny, quiet suspicion, and self-imposed silence. But as he scanned the rows of storage, his eyes settled on a box labeled, "Unofficially Property Theft." That box shouldn't have existed. Carter's memory, though dulled around the edges, immediately flagged the file number as one associated with a missing persons report, not theft. Something was wrong. He hesitated only a moment before sliding the box off the shelf and placing it on a nearby metal table, where he cut through the old city ceiling tape with a pocket knife he'd carried for decades. Inside were items that didn't belong: a school lanyard with Rachel Monroe's name, a torn pair of cheerleading gloves, and a paperback diary with a cracked spine and faded blue cover. Carter recognized it instantly. It had once been found at the scene of Rachel's disappearance. At least that was what had been reported when a hiker found the book near the old train bridge 2 weeks after the case went cold. Carter had been told it was destroyed due to water damage. But here it was, preserved and dry. No entry in the log said how or when it had been boxed, or who had moved it from the original evidence pile. No chain of custody signature, no initials. Just this mislabeled container that had been sitting in the dark for nearly 30 years. He sat down slowly, feeling the stiffness in his knees, and opened the diary with hands that trembled more from memory than age. Most pages were filled with idle thoughts, homework lists, crushes, insecurities, lyrics, but halfway through, near the March entries, a tone shift caught his attention. Rachel wrote in brief, coded sentences, describing a place she called the chlorine room. She never explained what it meant, but the repeated mentions of a red curtain, the overpowering smell of pool cleaner, and the phrase, "no clocks in the walls," appeared again and again. One entry simply said, "We went again. I held Lily's hand until the door closed." He always closes it. Another read, "Danielle says it's just a dream, but I saw the glove again. His hand is too clean." There were no names, no locations, just fragments that didn't make sense until Carter remembered something he'd seen once during a house call back in 1992. It had been a domestic dispute at the home of Gerald Fennick, a real estate investor who owned multiple properties across the county. At the time, Fennick had called the police to report a break-in, but when Carter arrived, he found no signs of forced entry. What stood out, though, was the basement guest room, decorated with thick red velvet curtains and lit by a single flickering fluorescent bulb. The carpet had been recently steam cleaned, and the whole room had reeked of chlorine. Carter had dismissed it at the time, chalking it up to obsessive cleaning. But now the memory snapped into place like a trap closing. He placed the diary on the table, staring at it like it was a loaded weapon. The timing, the details, the curtain. It wasn't coincidence. Rachel had seen that room. She had been in that house. Carter's heart pounded, a mix of dread and disbelief rising in his chest. He knew Fennick had never been interviewed in connection with the disappearances. No one had connected him to the girls. He had been a donor to the school district, a man with a pristine reputation, one of the mayor's inner circle. Carter had forgotten about him, or more accurately, he'd chosen not to remember. With effort, he lifted himself from the table and returned to the front office, where he asked the young clerk on duty for access to Fennick's old incident reports. The clerk, recognizing Carter's name, gave a polite nod and unlocked the digital archives without question. Carter searched for the 1992 report and found it missing, completely scrubbed, not sealed. That night, Carter sat in his home office staring at the open diary, his desk cluttered with old photos, police transcripts, and maps of Halstead's older neighborhoods. The chlorine room, the glove, the hand with no hair and no watch. Rachel had been leaving a map. The notes weren't teenage nonsense, they were accounts. Details only someone trying to record proof would write, and she had done so knowing it might not be found for years. She had given just enough to be dangerous, just enough to implicate someone if the right person cared to look. Carter wasn't sure why he did now. Maybe because he was sick of lying, even to himself. Maybe because he had worn down the armor he built around his own failures. Maybe because he had nothing left to protect. Or maybe because the silence had finally grown too loud. He began retracing the case slowly and alone. He drove past Fennick's old house, now owned by a medical practice and converted into an office suite. He noted that the basement windows had been sealed. He pulled the old building permit and found a 1994 renovation request citing flood damage and mold mitigation. The renovations had been approved by City Inspector Thomas Cullen, the brother of Max Cullen, the disgraced deputy who had openly joked about the case for years. Carter felt nausea creep up his throat. Too many names. Too many threads. He opened the diary again and reread the last few pages. One entry said, "If he finds this, he'll burn it, but if someone else finds it, tell them to check the one who never blinks." That phrase had haunted him before sleep for 2 nights straight, until he remembered an old-school nickname for Fennick, Shark Eyes, given by students because he never blinked during parent conferences. That weekend, Carter visited the old school files archived at the Halstead Public Library. He requested staff directories from the early 90s and combed through them until he found Rachel's homeroom teacher's notes. There, penciled in a margin, was a line under Fennick's name, Rachel's uncle's friend. Pays for gym uniforms. Carter nearly dropped the folder. The circle had always been tight. The corruption had always been quiet. But now it wasn't speculation anymore. Now it was a link. And Rachel had known it all along. She had seen what no one wanted to admit. And she had written it down, trusting someone would finally listen. Raymond Carter sat in his study the next morning, surrounded by chaos, maps layered with sticky notes, manila folders frayed at the corners, and hand-drawn diagrams of Fennick's former house, and the diary that had now become his only evidence that Rachel Monroe had not only been abducted, but had fought, documented, and resisted from within a system that had buried her. For the first time in his life, Carter realized he had completely misjudged her. She had never been the manipulative, attention-hungry girl he had painted her to be. She had been the one who saw everything and tried to leave behind a breadcrumb trail in the only way a 16-year-old could. The diary was not a cry for attention, it was an encrypted report. Rachel had understood what she was up against and had written in code not because she wanted to be clever, but because she knew that anyone reading it in real time, especially those involved, would destroy it. And perhaps they had tried. Perhaps someone had intercepted the diary before it could be processed and deliberately mislabeled it to prevent discovery. But they had missed something, or maybe grown careless, and now, decades later, the truth was clawing back into the light. One passage stood out more than the others, tucked at the bottom of a page that looked smudged, as though she had written it in a hurry. It read, "He's not the only one. The one who comes after smells like mint and bleach. He calls the others by number. I saw him once without gloves. There's a ring with initials A.W. I asked about the crest. He said it's the Monroe family seal." Carter blinked at the name, heart pounding. The Monroe family seal. The initials T.W. He stood up, nearly knocking over a cup of coffee that had gone cold, and pulled out a dusty box of archived news clippings and public records. It didn't take long to find what he was looking for. Thomas Winford, former mayor of Halstead, brother to Rachel's mother, had been known for his pristine public image and iron-tight control of the city council. During his tenure, Winford pushed through dozens of public provo projects, many of which involved rezoning properties under the guise of economic growth. His personal life had always been guarded, but Carter remembered the numerous, nothing ever proven, about Winford that dismissed those rumors at the time, thinking they were nothing more than small-town gossip aimed at a successful politician. But now, with the diary in his hand and the memory of Winford's impassive gaze during early press conferences, the pieces began falling into place. Rachel had been his niece. She had visited his home frequently during summer breaks, and she had stopped going entirely the year before she vanished. Carter dug through court records and found that Winford had overseen the final zoning approval on the very property where Fenwick's old house stood before it was converted into a commercial medical space. That wasn't coincidence. That was a paper trail. Rachel had been silenced not only because she was a witness, but because she had discovered something damning. In one of the final entries of her diary, Rachel had written, "I shouldn't have said anything about the photos. He told me I misunderstood." But the next night, Autumn was gone from the room. She came back with a bruise. She wouldn't look at me. He said we'd all go if we kept talking. Carter rereaded the name, Autumn, a detail he had never encountered in the original investigation, likely redacted or ignored. But it wasn't the name that chilled him. It was the mention of photos. If Rachel had seen photos, or worse, had them in her possession, it would explain the panic from whoever had abducted them. It would explain why the diary had been hidden. She hadn't just been a victim. She had been a whistleblower. Carter searched deeper, pulling phone records from city directories and requesting archived appointment logs from the public library under the pretense of historical research. One entry from 1992 showed Rachel checking out a book on classic encryption techniques. She had marked her name in cursive, and beside it was a note, "Holdeth Reference Desk." That meant she had likely discussed her interests from a librarian. Carter contacted the library and was eventually directed to a retired reference librarian named Ruth Decker. She lived 2 towns over now, retired for years, but when Carter mentioned Rachel's name, there was silence on the other end of the line, followed by a quiet sigh. "She was the only teenager who ever asked me about how to hide information in text," Ruth said. She wanted to know how to layer meaning, how to bury a message without making it look like a message. I remember asking her if it was for a school project. She said, "No, it's for safety." I never forgot that. Armed with this, Carter returned to the diary and began analyzing each line more critically. One coded phrase read, "The place under the place is where the real one begins. He says the cameras are broken, but they're not. They just blink different." Carter knew from old blueprints of the Fenwick property that there had been an unfinished root cellar beneath the main basement. It had been sealed during renovations, listed in public records as a structural liability. But there was no follow-up inspection report, no certificate of backfill. It was as if the space had been written out of existence. He reached out to a local real estate agent who confirmed that the current owners had never accessed the sub-basement, and no renovations had ever gone that deep. The lock on the lowest storage door remained, rusted shut. Carter realized the real horror wasn't just what Rachel had tried to tell the world, but what might still be buried beneath that house. He typed a formal request to the county court for access to the property under historical grounds, using the Preservation Commission as cover. He didn't plan to wait for approval. Time wasn't on his side. That night he scanned the last page of Rachel's diary again. One sentence hovered alone at the bottom, clearly written last, "If someone finds this, I forgive you for not listening sooner. But don't let them erase us twice." Carter sat in silence for a long time, listening to the wind against the window pane, feeling the weight of every year he had dismissed that girl as trouble. She hadn't just seen the truth, she had left it behind. She had named her uncle, she had pointed to the cameras, she had written of the others, and she had refused to go quietly. Raymond Carter stood in front of the house on Edgewater Lane as the sky thickened into an early summer storm, the air smelling faintly of ozone and cut grass. The property had changed since 1993. The ornate fence had been replaced with a modern iron gate, the hedges trimmed into artificial perfection, the windows covered with solar-tinted glass that reflected the world like dark mirrors. But the bones of the place were the same. This was still the house where Gerald Fennick once hosted quiet gatherings for the mayor's circle, where sealed envelopes passed between manicured hands, and where Rachel Monroe had been taken into the basement and left behind only traces of her terror. Carter carried with him a rusted key he had found years ago in a box labeled Miss Locker 82 in the evidence vault. He'd held onto it without knowing why, sensing it was important. Now he understood. The storage door in the lower basement had never been refitted, and the real estate agent had confirmed that the lock had not been changed. Carter walked down the side path of the property with heavy steps, ducked behind the utility wall, and slipped in through the back access that workers had once used during remodeling. He moved with practiced silence, flashlight steady in one hand, the key wrapped in cloth in the other. The first basement was sterile, converted into a storage area with metal cabinets and clinical lighting. But behind a shelf of unused lighting fixtures was a false wall. He found it by tapping and listening for the hall thud. The panel was nailed crudely, and behind it was a narrow stairwell of concrete steps, slick with time. At the bottom of those steps, he found the original door, the one no blue blade had shown. He inserted the key, felt resistance, then a sharp click. The door creaked open and released a rush of air that smelled like mildew and bleach. His flashlight beam fell upon a small square room, untouched since the 1990s. The walls were lined with red velvet curtains, now moth-eaten and damp, and the concrete floor was stained in patches, some of which had darkened beyond recognition. The light flickered over a low cot, a child's shoe, and the remains of what appeared to be a wooden crate, broken open at one corner. In the far end of the room stood a steel locker, sealed with a latch. Carter opened it and found a sealed cardboard box, wrapped in layers of black plastic. Inside there were 4 items: a pink plastic comb, a half-melted cassette tape, a cracked watch with the initials RM engraved on the inside, and a photograph. He turned the photograph over slowly, the breath catching in his throat as the image revealed itself. 4 girls stood in a line, clearly terrified, facing the camera as if instructed, with their wrists bound in front of them. Behind them stood Gerald Fennick, wearing a surgical mask and rubber gloves, and beside him, unmistakable even under the baseball cap and sunglasses, stood Thomas Winford. Carter staggered backward, the flashlight clattering to the ground. He had suspected it, had pieced together Rachel's codes, had theorized the connections. But this was proof, hard, undeniable physical evidence that the former mayor and his associate had been involved in the abduction and likely murder of the Halstead Four. He picked up the flashlight with shaking hands, scanning the rest of the room for anything else, but the box was the crown jewel. As he backed out of the room, he noticed one final detail. Etched into the wall behind the cot was a message written in what looked like chalk, smeared and faded. He leaned closer and made out the words, "Not all of us died." His breath hitched. It was not a note of despair. It was a message, a warning, a defiance. By the time Carter returned to his car, the sky had opened into a downpour, but he didn't care. He drove directly to the office of Sheriff Elias Granger, bypassing all formal channels. When Granger saw the photograph, his face turned pale, his hands trembling as he stared at the image. "This changes everything," he muttered. Carter nodded. "It's time to burn it all down." Within 24 hours, a warrant was executed for the arrest of Gerald Fennick, now a semi-retired developer living in a gated community 30 miles outside of town. DNA taken from the concrete floor in the sub-basement matched partial remains found at an undisclosed burial site near Halstead Creek, linked years earlier to an unidentified juvenile female. The cracked watch belonged to Rachel Monroe, confirmed through etching records from a local engraver. When confronted with the evidence, Fennick refused to speak, requesting a lawyer before collapsing from what doctors later called a stress-induced heart arrhythmia. He was hospitalized under guard. News spread quickly as media trucks returned to Halstead for the first time in decades. But the real storm came when the photo was leaked. A low-resolution copy appeared on a conspiracy blog, then was picked up by larger outlets. Commenters quickly identified Thomas Winford despite the disguise. He had gone on to become a respected state senator after leaving Halstead, his reputation pristine, his name synonymous with leadership. The revelation of his presence in that photograph triggered a seismic backlash. Political allies distanced themselves. The state ethics board convened an emergency review, and the local press, once compliant and indifferent, now ran headlines dripping with betrayal. Carter watched it unfold from his porch, the photo of the girls propped against his window, as if he were daring the world to forget them again. Inside the Halstead Police Department, the tremors were even worse. Carter returned to the station he once commanded, this time not as a figure of authority, but as a man dragging history into the light. He handed over the remaining contents of the evidence box to Internal Affairs, demanding full disclosure and federal oversight. One officer, new and earnest, asked him what it felt like to finally be on the right side of the story. Carter stared at him a long time before saying, "I don't know if I ever was. But I'm here now." As news of the discovery reached survivors and their descendants, silent voices began to speak. Anonymous emails arrived detailing school cover-ups, police threats, and hush money that had changed hands over the years. Carter kept every message, printed them, and filed them in a drawer labeled Testimony. Meanwhile, demolition orders were filed for the Edgewater Lane house. The city declared it a site of criminal significance and a symbol of institutional failure. Carter stood at the fence line on the morning of the first demolition crew arrival. He didn't cheer. He didn't cry. He simply watched the machines tear through the walls that had hidden so many crimes, feeling the weight of memory press against his chest like a warning. The secrets were coming undone, one beam at a time. And the house, like the silence that had protected it, was crumbling. The morning of Gerald Fennick's arraignment arrived beneath a cold and colorless sky, as if the very air held its breath in anticipation of what was finally unfolding after nearly 3 decades of silence, deception, and systemic betrayal. Outside the Halstead courthouse, a growing crowd of journalists, former residents, and survivors' relatives gathered behind police barricades, watching with narrowed eyes as the black transport van pulled to the curb and officers escorted Fennick into the building, with his head down and hands cuffed tightly behind his back. The courtroom was packed, though the man who had once stood beside him in the photo. He had resigned from the state senate just 2 days earlier, issuing a carefully worded statement blaming political sabotage. Though privately, sources confirmed that federal investigators had already opened an inquiry into his time as mayor, his connections to regional law enforcement, and a trail of sealed records stretching from Halstead to the governor's office. Raymond Carter sat quietly in the gallery, a worn notebook in his lap and the original photograph tucked inside his coat pocket like a holy relic, knowing that despite his years of failure and dismissal, his presence now meant something, not just to the families who had waited in the shadows, but to the truth itself, which had been buried for too long beneath privilege and bureaucracy. The prosecution presented its opening with a force Halstead hadn't seen in a generation. They laid out the chain of custody, the resurfaced diary, the confirmed DNA evidence from the sub-basement, the notarized building permits signed by Cullen, and the financial documents linking Fennick's development firm to the city's emergency budget allocations under Winford's term. But the centerpiece of their argument was the photograph, introduced into evidence under seal, shown to the jury with a brief but devastating explanation of its origin and authentication. The lead prosecutor, a woman named Veronica Chase, told the jury plainly, "The state believes this image captures not only the crime of unlawful detainment, but the complicity of leadership, the betrayal of duty, and the willing concealment of 4 children's suffering." In a move that stunned local officials, Chase also announced an active warrant for the arrest of Thomas Winford, who had fled the state the night before. Marshals were now pursuing him under federal charges, including obstruction of justice, conspiracy, and child endangerment. The room exploded in a flurry of voices and camera flashes. Carter simply nodded once, slowly, as if ticking off a final box he'd been waiting to cross out for decades. Meanwhile, across town, the family of Rachel Monroe held a press conference of their own, led not by her mother, Gloria, but by her younger cousin, Jamie, who had been a toddler at the time of the disappearance and had grown up listening to whispers in the family kitchen and watching her aunt fade into quiet grief. Jamie addressed the cameras with the poise of someone who had inherited not just the trauma, but the fire Rachel had once carried. "This is not a day for victory," she said, "because justice delayed is not justice served. But it is a day of reckoning, and my cousin Rachel made sure this day would come, even if she couldn't be here to see it." Behind her stood the families of Lily, Danielle, and Tasha, their faces lined by time and weathered by sorrow, but their presence fierce and unwavering. No one interrupted. Back in the courtroom, Fenwick's defense unraveled with astonishing speed. What began as a denial evolved into contradiction and finally collapsed into silence. The DNA match could not be explained, the renovation files could not be discredited, and the photo, so damning in its clarity, left even the most skeptical observers without refuge. But it was the final witness that shattered the remaining illusions. A woman entered the courtroom with a blanket over her head, escorted by federal agents. When she revealed her face, gasps rippled through the audience. She was Olivia, known only until that moment by her recovery identity and long-preserved anonymity. Olivia was one of the Halstead 4, presumed dead, never officially identified, but here she stood, alive, scarred, and ready. Her testimony was methodical and piercing. She confirmed the existence of the chlorine room, the use of code names among the captors, the movement she last saw Rachel alive, bound but whispering to her. "Don't forget who you are. Don't let them erase you." Olivia spoke of Winford's presence, of the cold authority he carried, of how he never touched them but issued the orders that controlled those who did. Her words sliced through the courtroom like wind through glass. The jury watched in stunned silence. Carter felt his chest seize with a mixture of awe and pain. Rachel had saved Olivia, and Olivia had saved the truth. The impact of her testimony reached beyond the trial. Within 72 hours, 5 other local officials were subpoenaed, including 2 former school board members and a city clerk who had allegedly signed off on the disposal of evidence in 1994. The media dubbed it the Halstead Reckoning. National outlets descended on the town. Documentarians began tracing the network of real estate transactions and school funding anomalies that hinted at a wider ring of collusion. But most striking of all was what happened to Fenwick's empire. His holdings were frozen. His development contracts were rescinded. Former employees came forward with stories of hush payments and internal threats. Shareholders publicly disavowed him. A man once considered untouchable now sat alone in a county cell, waiting to be transferred to a federal holding facility while the court debated whether to try him under state or federal jurisdiction first. Carter, for all his complicated history, became a reluctant symbol of redemption. Some called him a hero, others called him complicit. He rejected both. He told the few reporters who asked for comment, "I didn't solve this, Rachel did. I just stopped running in private." He penned a letter to be opened only upon his death, addressed to every survivor and family member involved. He had read, in part, "Forgiveness is not a right I claim, but I offer the truth with both hands. I failed you then. I won't look away again." The town of Halstead, shaken and ashamed, began organizing a formal public memorial, not orchestrated by City Hall, but by students at the local high school who had uncovered the stories their textbooks had refused to tell. The memorial would include plaques, photographs, and a digital archive containing every known record, testimony, and newspaper clipping. It would be open to the public, and it would never close. As for Winford, his capture came 2 weeks later in a remote cabin in Montana where he was living under an alias and preparing to cross into Canada. He was extradited immediately. His mugshot ran on every major network in the country. The man once heralded as the architect of Halstead's prosperity now stood as a warning against unchecked power. His arraignment was scheduled for the following month. Rachel's diary was submitted into permanent federal evidence. Olivia received full protective status and began working with victim advocacy groups under a new identity. And Carter, though aging and increasingly frail, stood by the courthouse steps each morning of the trial, holding a copy of the photograph, greeting every family member with a nod and the same words, "We're still here." The last echoes of the trial settled over Halstead like the dust after a long-forgotten storm, coating the sidewalks and doorways and whispered conversations in the knowledge that nothing could ever truly return to the way it had been. The courthouse, once a monument to selective memory, now stood as a place where truth had finally breached the surface, and its corridors held the weight of what had been exposed. Gerald Fennick was sentenced to life without parole, and Thomas Winford, in a twist no one predicted, took a plea deal in exchange for revealing the names of others involved in the cover-up, including a former state superintendent and a high-ranking church official who had served as moral pillars of the community for decades. Each name sent shockwaves through the town's brittle image of itself, collapsing illusions faster than the press could publish them. As the last gavel fell and the final appeal was denied, Halstead became not just a place marked by its crimes, but one defined by its confrontation with them. But for Raymond Carter, the reckoning did not bring peace, only clarity. He was diagnosed with stage 4 lung cancer 6 months after the verdict. By the time his body showed the symptoms, the disease had spread too far. He refused aggressive treatment. He refused pity. Instead, he returned to the room above his garage and began writing. Each night, through pain and coughs that shook his ribs, he typed out a letter to the future. It was not addressed to anyone specific, but to every officer who might one day find themselves choosing between career and conscience. He included case files, scant photos, annotated reflections, and, most importantly, Rachel's diary. Every page transcribed and annotated with the context she never lived long enough to provide. He titled it Second Sunrise, A Guide to Listening. In his final months, he also reached out to Olivia, who now lived under protection in another state, and apologized in the only way he could, by giving her complete control over how her story would be told. She declined interviews, but agreed to provide an anonymous statement for the town's memorial, one that would sit beside Rachel's final diary entry. It read, "They thought silence would save them, but we remembered, and remembering was enough to break the lock." Carter also reconnected with Jamie Monroe, now a fierce advocate for missing persons reform, and entrusted her with all of his findings, along with a single sentence, "You saw what we refused to." In the weeks before his death, Carter watched as the town he had once defended out of fear began to shift beneath the weight of truth. The Halstead Police Department underwent a full audit. A civilian oversight committee was formed. Every cold case from 1975 to 2005 was re-examined by a task force including independent experts. 3 more convictions followed, but the most powerful transformation came not from courts or headlines, but from a small plaque installed in the town square beneath a newly planted tree. It bore 4 names: Rachel Monroe, Lily Carr, Danielle Brooks, and Tasha Greene. Below them, a single inscription read, "Your voices were never lost. We just failed to hear them. We hear you now." During the dedication, no official spoke. Only Jamie stepped forward, holding Rachel's photograph in one hand and the diary in the other. She didn't quote scripture or plead for forgiveness. She simply said, "We remember, and remembering is how we fight." Even the most arrogant of the old guard could not ignore the wave. One evening, local news cameras rolled as Maxwell Cullen, the former deputy known for his cruel jokes and backroom laughter, stood before the same memorial and publicly confessed what he had buried for years. He had been ordered to destroy the security tape from the convenience store in 1993. He had watched the footage. He had seen Rachel with an unknown man at the edge of the frame, and he had removed it before it could be entered into evidence. His voice cracked as he admitted to burning it behind the station, alone, convinced he was protecting the department. "They told me it was better this way," he said. "The story needed to end before it embarrassed the whole town, but that was a lie. We weren't protecting anyone. We were hiding a wound and blaming the scar on the ones who bled." The crowd stood in silence. No applause, no forgiveness, just acknowledgement. Cullen walked away with tears on his cheeks and his badge, now tarnished, pinned backward to his lapel. In Carter's absence, Jamie launched an organization called Second Sunrise, named after his manuscript. Its mission was clear: to investigate forgotten disappearances across the country with the urgency that Halstead had denied its own. Within a year, the group had solved 2 other cold cases and uncovered new evidence in 5 more. Survivors previously buried by shame or doubt began to write in. The project grew. The memory of Rachel Monroe expanded beyond her town, becoming a symbol of resistance against silence. The girls were no longer statistics. They were anchors in a national movement to prevent institutional erasure. Their faces appeared in classrooms, training manuals, and online databases. Every missing child listed by the project carried a timestamp and a single line at the bottom. In his final days, Carter dictated a video message from his hospice bed. He did not dress in uniform. He did not speak with scripted gravitas. He looked into the camera and said, "I spent years building walls around a truth I didn't want to see. Not because I hated those girls, but because I didn't believe I could make a difference if I said what I knew. But I was wrong. Saying it matters. Speaking up matters. And if you ever find yourself standing in front of a choice between comfort and truth, I hope you remember what happened here. Don't protect the powerful. Protect the silent." He died 3 days later. The town held a vigil, not to praise him, but to reflect. People lit candles at the memorial. School children placed notes written to Rachel and her friends beneath the tree. One simply read, "We hear you. We're sorry. We will not forget." The final chapter of the Halstead tragedy did not end in fireworks or redemption arcs tied in perfect bows. It ended with work, real, painful, honest work. The town rebuilt its archives. Survivors found each other and wrote books, taught workshops, healed in groups. Some left Halstead and never returned. Others stayed and planted gardens over the places where walls once stood. The house on Edgewater Lane was torn down. The land converted into a community orchid. Every tree planted was named for a girl whose story had once gone unheard. And under the blossoms each spring, the town remembered what it had done and what it had almost lost. In the end, it was not punishment that defined Halstead's legacy. It was the decision to finally stop looking away. If this story moved you, even a little, take a second to like this video and subscribe for more true stories that reveal what silence can bury and what courage can unearth. We want to hear from you. What part of the plot struck you the hardest? Was it Rachel's coded diary, Olivia's return, or the final confession under that quiet tree? And where are you watching this from? What city? What country? What time of night? Drop it in the comments. Your voice matters, just like theirs did. Let's keep remembering. Let's keep listening.